Hi, guys. Welcome to another episode of Pilot Talk, the podcast where we talk about everything aviation, ranging from flight training to how you get your first pilot job and succeed in your flying career to the latest aviation news. Hope you enjoyed today's episode. All right, we got a really special guest with us today, Michelle, and I was hoping that maybe you would do the honors of introducing him.
It would be my honor and my pleasure. Today we are going to talk about psychometrics that will be introduced as a requirement by EASA in next August 2020. And our special guest and a special friend for both of us is Captain Michael Keating, pilot extraordinaire, I may say.
Indeed.
He's got almost 40 years, if not more, experience as a commercial pilot, ex-military pilot, fast air pilot. His nom de guerre, his war name is Ket 16, and we're gonna interview him, and we're gonna talk about psychometrics.
That sounds super exciting. It's something Michael's been spending quite some time getting himself into and learning about. So I'm really looking forward to picking his brain and learning more about the exciting future of psychometric evaluation of pilots. That's
Exactly,
really cool.
exactly.
You are listening to Pilot Talk by OSM Aviation.
All right, Michael, thank you again for coming and joining us today for this special episode. I'm pretty excited and I'm pretty psyched, and I know Stein is as well. Psychometrics, wow, it's a complicated word, and it means a lot, and I know it's a big deal, and I can't wait to learn more about it from your expertise and your knowledge. But now that it's such a big deal, and it's going to become sort of a requirement for each pilot to be tested by next year, August 2020. Tell me why now and not sooner.
Well, first of all, it's important to know that psychometrics has been around for 60 years, maybe more, and has been part of military selection of pilots for all that time around the world. And psychometrics, to understand what it is basically measuring the human mind for personality and abilities. So psychometric is something we've been using not only for pilots, but for hiring people in all kinds of businesses.
So my question is, why have they now started to put it? Why have they decided to put it now and make it a regulation? That's the big one.
Well, a few years ago, if most people recollect that a German pilot decided to take his life. He was flying a German airline, and he flew his Airbus jet into the side of the mountain in France. Right. And you couldn't sit down and not do anything from the authorities' side, so they decided to set down a committee that would come up with new rules, and they encompass a lot more than just psychometrics. They also encompass things like medical checks, drug and alcohol tests, and of course suggestions to how you hire pilots. Right. Apparently, the airline industry has been very, very differing on how you hire pilots, from a simple interview to a 5-day testing. So it's the first time we've seen in Europe that there is actually a kind of rule set out for it.
Yeah, I remember that accident. That was really terrible, and it's tragic, unbelievable.
Horrible.
Oh, terrible. I can't believe someone can do that, actually. I guess, and knowing what happened and reading the reports, it looks like they knew that he had a problem already.
It was known, but doctors have their hypocritical oath, and they can't divulge to others either. They can do no harm, and they cannot tell anybody else about their patients. Right. So in a way, it was all kept to the doctors that the person saw. And nobody really nobody who were in charge of airlines had any knowledge of this.
Well, that's interesting, because is that going to entail a change? I mean, we know that medical personnel can't disclose medical information, but is that going to change in the sense that, they will be able to when it comes to flying personnel in the future?
Yeah, true.
Both yes and no. because in some countries it might still be a problem to divulge what a medical person learns about somebody, but it changes by the fact that the medical person in charge would have to do an evaluation and cannot issue a medical license if that person believes that there is a psychological or psychiatric problem underlying. They were going to change the rules to include mental fitness when you select pilots. However, they've sort of restricted themselves to just standard psychometric tests. You distinguish between a psychometric test, a normal test, and a clinical test. A clinical test is where you measure whether persons have, for example, bipolar diseases. It could be schizophrenia, depression, any kind of disease like that, all the way to just being a hypochondriac has a clinical part of it. You don't do that in an airline. But what you do is we now have to have a psychologist associated with the pilot selection to make sure that somebody who has the knowledge and the training understands what he sees in front of him or her in a selection situation.
So does that mean that the airlines are going to need their own psychologists, an aviation psychologist, I guess? So you can't just take a medical psychologist like you call the hospital and say, listen, I need people to be tested. Can you come over and administer some tests? I guess. So are they going to have their own psychologists, and are they going to do their own report, and are they going to debrief the pilot? What's going to happen there?
It doesn't say that directly, but it does say that you have to have somebody overseeing the psychometric testing. And that means you can either have somebody doing it on a full-time basis, and all the way to you can have somebody connected to your airline who has to oversee the actual admittance of pilots. So there would be somebody who would at least look at the process and approve the process and approve that the process is always updated as necessary, who has a psychological background, and preferably somebody who's been working in the airline industry. So it's just not a psychologist, it's also somebody who's been working with pilots before, or at least aircrew. So it's a bit of a tricky thing to do, and I think a lot of airlines are going to struggle with finding those exact persons, but there's nothing stopping us from using, let's say, 5 airlines using the same psychologist.
I mean, I'm not an expert on this, but it seems to me that there's not that many aviation psychologists out there right now. Is that correct?
Not that many. We've had like a 15, 20-year recession in airlines where we haven't hired very many pilots. And now that that's probably going to change because the old pilots are now retiring in big numbers. There is going to be quite a requirement for new aviation-approved psychologists. We're still waiting to see what EASA would approve because we don't know how much experience do you need as a psychologist or what kind of psychologist do you have to be. The only thing that EASA stipulates is it doesn't have to be a clinical psychologist. Right. Actually, we shouldn't use a clinical psychologist. But that's about as much as we know.
Pilot Talk with Stein Mjotvid and Michelle Treskin.
So when it comes to situations like this, when there's a surge or a high demand, is there going to be put training in place in a structure to certify people? Because that to me seems like it's not very clear at this point. But do you see that becoming,
like
more
a school
solidified?
Or something? Yeah.
Well, the first thing I noticed when the new set of rules came out was that for the first time, EASA is pointing at another agency, IATA, the International Aviation Transport Association. EASA published a white paper a few years ago, I think it was back in 2012. It's now been developed to a full spec on how do you do pilot selection, including the psychometric test, the testing and simulator, anything that you put into a normal pilot selection process. And IATA is now pointing to the IATA white paper in their acceptable means of compliance on how to do a good selection process. That's a new thing I've never seen before. I've never seen IATA point to something else, or JAROPS for that matter, before them. So this is new.
So it's going to be up to the discretion of the company to have that kind of selection process.
Yes, because they always talk about doing it best practices for the industry.
Oh, all right.
But what is best practices? So they had to come up with an example. And I think they found the IATA white paper to be international enough and have enough details about a pilot selection process. So I guess you can say if you want to use acceptable means of compliance, have a read through the IATA or the IATA white paper and do what they do, and you'll be fine.
Well, that's really good advice, Michael. And just to summarize, so what you're saying is that every pilot will now be psychometrically tested, and then the next question becomes: is it then the airline's responsibility to have a set guideline for the selection process, or is this something that's going to be dictated by EASA or IATA? Will psychometrics done in a certain way be mandatory, or will the airlines actually have an influence over the process?
Yeah.
It's hard to say at this stage because it's untested so far. They've just put out these, it's actually a draft, but it's supposed to come into effect on August the 14th, 2020, as you said. And that means that every airline under EASA must have a selection process. It doesn't say anything about it having to be approved. Right. But once we get into the audits, you have the IATA audit or the standard EASA audits. They might find you wanting if you're not following the rules or the acceptable means of compliance that EASA has laid out. So it's going to evolve slowly into probably more rules. I don't know. But once they've tested this, we're going to see EASA come up with probably more means of compliance, more suggestions to how you do this. But one thing is for sure, today no airline has a requirement on them from any authority to have a pilot selection process. Right. For the first time, we see that the pilot selection process has to be in place by training units and by airlines around Europe. And if they haven't been tested in the last 24 months, you have to do a new test. And the whole thing has to go into your risk assessment system as well, so your safety management system. It is interlinked.
All right.
So unless you're a small company with less than a certain number of employees, you should follow the acceptable means of compliance in the EASA rules.
Okay, Roger, that I understand now. But at the OSM Aviation Academy, we already have a selection process. We got a selection process for our future students. We got a selection process for our future instructors. But now that it's going to become a requirement, a mandate for airlines to have a selection process, including the psychometrics, will that become mandatory for all flight schools as well?
There is a mandatory. I mean, this is part of the flight school schools will be part of it because at initial training start, there has to be a psychometric test as well. That follows the same guidelines, because the very initial part of becoming a pilot is that you can pass a process that involves psychometrics. But I think that's very well ingrown into the schools today, but I'll hand that to Stein.
Oh, that's interesting. I mean, for OSM Aviation Academy, we've been doing psychometric testing for such a long time. It's always been a part of what we do. And, for us, there's three parts of this that motivates having this in place. Yeah. First of all, we screen the pilots for their own sake more than anything. We want to make sure that they have the aptitude to succeed in their education and later on in their career before they start spending precious time and money on a pilot education.
Absolutely.
But then it's also for us as the school, because we want every student who enrolls at OSM Aviation Academy to be successful on their educational path with us, to make it, to thrive and to reach their full potential. But, and then the third reason is that the reason why we have such long-standing relationships with many of our partner airlines is because we have the rigorous testing. Yeah, and the quality.
That's right.
The quality for them, from their perspective, is high. It's predictable. It's on a constant level. So, for us, the changes, it's really exciting. I mean, we're very positive towards this industry-wide adaptation of the testing.
Yeah.
But, for us, I don't think it's going to be that big of a change because we've been doing this for a very long time.
Abnormal.
Yeah, it's ops normal, and we're ready to make any adjustments that are needed, and we're ready to make that change. But overall, it's just really positive for the whole industry.
Yeah, it's great.
Yeah.
It makes sense because many airlines still, even today, have that. But when IATA did a survey, they found that only less than 1 in 5 airlines around the world had a proper selection process that covered at least the aspects we've been discussing here, including psychometrics.
Oh, that's low.
And of course, we've had some, it's very safe to fly nowadays, but the accident we have are almost solely pilot error when you look at the safety reports afterwards. And some of these errors could actually have been avoided by many little details that we could have added in the selection procedure, making sure that they had the proper training. When IATA came out with their evidence-based training, this is part of that too. This also shows us that evidence-based is slightly better because you want to make sure that the pilot has understood every instruction you do and that they can comply by them. But the psychometric itself, no, it's not new, and many have used it. And as you say, we used it for many years in the airlines we've been with and in the military. This is just the first time we've seen it on paper, that it's become more or less of a law. And remember, the EU is a parliament, and when they come out with something, it is actually law that's been voted in by the European Union government.
Right. Yeah, I get that. Yeah, but so does that mean that every pilot will be tested and that test is valid for 24 months, right? That's the way it's going to be. But now every time they change company, does that mean that they'll be tested again?
Unless the airline can establish that you have been flying with another airline that maybe they're closely affiliated with. Those rules are a little bit unclear, but you have to establish that the person doesn't have to be tested, and there's going to be very strong conviction that that person doesn't have to be tested. So yes, I think what's going to happen is every time you change airline, you're going to be tested by the new airline, which would be something you already do today. Right. You would start their process, which might be slightly different. Because remember, EASA leaves it up to you to decide a lot of this content. They say, use best practices in the industry, use what you find to work best for your airline, but try to comply with what we've asked you to do, and that is introduce psychometric testing in your daily or in your selection work. And if you don't have that, well, now's the time to introduce it.
So basically what you're saying, Michael, is that each airline, to their discretion, will have their own psychometrics testing as long as they follow the guidelines that were made by EASA. But knowing that now and knowing that it's coming, can pilots prepare for these tests in any way? Again,
I'd refer to IATA's white paper because they touch upon this subject, which is a very good question. They say there's a lot of little agencies out there that are charging pilots for helping them practice for this or that test, whether that be Mollymock or Compass or Symbiotics testing. They are all trainable, but only to a certain extent, because a lot of the psychometrics are different, they vary, and the question bank will be large. So it's going to be practicing to, let's say, make yourself less nervous when you go in for these tests, because they will more or less chart what you can do psychologically, personality-wise, ability-wise, if it's a good test.
Yeah, it's incredible tests. I've been through them, and when we were in the Eastern Airlines or Middle Eastern Airlines, and it's an eye-opener when you go through it, and I tell you something like that. And another thing, something that a lot of people don't know is that if you do lie, or you're not honest about your answers, it shows up on the test.
That's amazing.
Yeah, incredible.
I would suggest that most airlines go in and look at these tests that are on the market today and make sure that it is hard to cheat them, that they have lie detectors inside, because if you have to use these tests, why not use them to the optimum? Make sure that their tests are working for you, and that it's actually what you're looking for. But remember, you're not just testing people for the sake of EASA. You're testing them for your own sake. You want people that you can work with. So part of your personality and ability testing should chart whether these people are up to your standards and follow your culture and can follow your kind of working patterns. So there's many reasons to introduce these tests if you don't have them already.
Pilot Talk, available on iTunes, Spotify, or osmaviation.com/podcast.
Yeah, last question for me, Michael. Actually, I think it's a multiples question, but I'm going to play devil's advocate here, and let's pretend that I've got 20,000 hours. I've been flying for 15, 20 years, and I go through the test, and I'm not in the zone. I'm not in the passing zone. I fail. What happens then? Am I going to be blacklisted? I know I won't be able to fly anymore. And is there a time period where I have to wait? Do I have to go through counseling to get my license back? There's a lot of questions that needs to be answered, I guess. But basically, what will be the consequence if you're not successful?
That's up to the operator. That's up to the airline. There are some suggestions if you read the IATA paper. For how long should you wait? There are some suggestions on if you buy a psychometric test from a company that makes them, then there are some suggestions to how long should you wait before you retest. It's hard to answer that question in one simple sentence because it all depends on where did you do, what did you fail on, what part of it was it, and there's nothing stopping you from seeking employment with another company and doing a test with them. Right. There's nowhere in the procedures that bars you from getting a job just because you failed a psychometric test. We're talking about psychometric test, not psychiatric test, right, or any bipolar disorder or anything like that. Because if you fail that, you will not become a pilot, at least not as long as you're sick. We can say if you have a depression, if it's momentary, you could be licensed or recertificated after you've been diagnosed as well again. But you cannot fly in the future with a known clinical disorder. And that's one of the things you want to avoid in that Germanwings accident we heard about earlier. It is something we don't want to see again.
Yeah, well, I can just imagine a pilot that's flying for 20 years and suddenly gets tested, and he's told that, hey, listen, I'm sorry, but you don't fit the profile. Imagine that he or she, what she goes through, and ethically, you've been flying and you're doing your job and everything's been well. You got a clean record, and suddenly the psych tells you, "Hey, I'm sorry, but you're not in the zone."
It's an excellent topic, and I think we have a whole new podcast topic to discuss later on, because that is a very, very good question. What happens if a 20-year pilot all of a sudden is declared unfit to fly? But it is exactly, I guess, the same as when you're medically unfit to fly. Right. You will be unfit for either temporarily or for a long term, which means I think we've discharged the term permanent loss of license in EASA. You can only be temporarily without a license, but that temporarily could be the rest of your life, especially if you never come back to fly again. But because we don't know what illnesses can be cured in the future, we've just gotten rid of the expression permanent loss of license. Right. So it's more or less just temporary, always temporary.
I was wondering if your chance of failing are increased as you get older.
That's a really interesting question, and on that note, I'd like to take another parallel. I met a manager from the gaming industry a couple of weeks back, and we were talking about aptitude and mental capacity and all these things, and she told me that she would only screen gamers in their early to mid-20s and preferably even younger.
Video gamers.
Yeah, video gamers.
Right.
So she was like a manager, just like a manager for a football team. She was a manager for professional video gamers, and she told me, after the mid-20s, the mental capacity will start declining,
really?
deteriorating. But, I think it's important to mention, though, however, that as pilots, it's different. because as you grow older, you will gain experience on the type that you're flying.
Yeah, you get better.
Exactly, and the type of operations.
True.
Obviously, the decision making, the problem solving, all these things.
Yeah.
So with age comes experience, but as we all know, every flight is meticulously planned down to the very smallest detail. But once we get into the plane and we get cleared for takeoff, we press play. Curveballs can come around every corner. So, but like I said, you wear the aircraft; it's part of you. It's like you wear the machine. As you gain experience, you become one with it.
Yeah.
And because of those reasons, I don't think that the gaming industry is directly correlatable to the aviation industry.
Right.
But, I don't know. What do you guys think?
I would say most fighter pilots are at their peak when they're around 27, 28 years old, because they got a little bit of experience, 6, 7 years, and they're now wiser and slightly older. But then after that, things start going slowly downhill, and their reaction time increases. And that makes them slightly worse fighter pilots. I mean, you can fly the aircraft probably till you're 60 or 65. But if you have to fight in a war with it, then you need your faculties to be up to the most acute. And most air forces keep the young fighter pilots at the front end. Yeah,
definitely. Good point on the fighter pilot stuff. I'm definitely too old to get on the air combat maneuver. I feel good. I feel that I'm capable of going out there and fight with the young guys. But I think you're right. Definitely, I do slow down as I get older. But cognitively, as we get older, our mental capacity declines.
It does. But then there's the other side of it called experience. And that is when you've seen something before and you don't want to go there. You can never underestimate the threat and error management of a senior pilot. I've always said, the best team is an older captain and a younger pilot, first officer. Because if you got two of one or two of the other, you're missing out on either experience or your reaction time.
Hey, that's just like you and me there, Stein, the old and the young guy.
Exactly, yeah. Balancing each other out.
Exactly. The eagle and the owl.
The eagle and the owl.
Yeah. Well, on that note, listen, Michael, it was quite an interesting conversation we had. I think that our listeners will love this.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much for coming.
You're welcome.
You definitely are... your insights and your visions and what you think of psychometrics in the whole, I think that's just fabulous.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming on the show, Michael. It's really great having you here today.
Great being here.
Okay, guys, so to wrap things up, remember, you can find this podcast everywhere where podcasts are to be found. It's on iTunes, on Spotify, on Podbean, and so on and so forth. And we also have an Instagram account, so please go and follow us on Instagram. It's called the Pilot Talk Podcast. Just search for it there. And we would love you guys to send us some pictures of when you're sitting listening to our podcast. And so if you send those pictures in, we'll pick out a few that we might post on our Instagram page, and you'll get a little surprise from us.
Ooh,
so that's exciting. All righty.
Right on.
And on that note, blue skies.
And happy landings.
Ciao.
Bye.